former colonel, senior colonel for the People's Liberation Army. And we have a lot of questions to get to because, especially for Americans and Western audiences, there's a lot of misunderstanding, especially on the geopolitical front and the military front when it comes to China-U.S. relations and China's role in the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So let us get right into it with regard to especially the South China Sea and the Philippines, because there seems to be many stories, many news stories coming out in the West about China and the Philippines getting into skirmishes. It's being described as confrontation. And I wanted to ask you about your understanding of these growing tensions that the U.S. and the West are talking about at the moment. What is China's position on the South China Sea, and what is actually going on between China and the Philippines?
Thank you, Mr. Haifeng. Actually, you have asked a number of good questions, and it's not so easy for me to just give you a short answer, but I just try my best. You see, when there is a kind of rivalry between a giant like China and a small country like the Philippines, people instinctively have more sympathy for the small one. Yeah, because this is human nature. As I said before, just like people love baby cucumber, baby tomato, they just look more adorable and more eatable even in some sense. So in this case, I understand how people might feel, but let me give you a simple fact. The fact is, very few people seem to know that actually it is the Filipinos who killed Chinese 3 times in the history. That is in 2000, 2006, and 2013. 3 times against the innocent Chinese fishermen from both mainland and from Taiwan, which is part of China. So if you suddenly realize this and know that China has never used force against the Filipinos, then your perception might change. Because in 1999, the Filipino government deliberately stranded a rusted warship of the Second World War time in what is international as a Second Thomas Shoal. And of course, China protested, but they made some promise, but they claimed the so-called technical difficulties, and so they didn't tow it away. So then it became an issue. But think of this. Given the overwhelming military strength of the PLA, if we have decided to do something, couldn't we easily resolve this issue? The simple question is, how can those Marine Corps soldiers have stayed there for 25 years if the Chinese government and the PLA are not self-restrained? So then, of course, let's talk about something else. Yes, the Chinese have used water cannons, and that might be very impressive on TV cameras, especially if the other side turned out to be a small country. But I would argue that this is precisely because we do not want to use force. So this is the kind of deterrence to deter the Filipino Coast Guard from delivering building materials to fortify the rusted ship to turn it into a permanent base.
Yes, and as you were talking, it got me thinking about how when I read U.S. in Western mainstream media, it's often talked about that China has aggressive ambitions in the South China Sea and that the disputes solely are to be laid upon, or at least the blame for them, or to be laid upon China because, as you said, China is the bigger country. What is the truth here then about this? Because these disputes are very misunderstood. I don't think if you ask the ordinary person in the United States, what do you know about it? Yeah. What would you say?
Well, in the West, I read Western media as well. It is often said that China wants to turn South China Sea into a Chinese lake. It's not the case, because according to Chinese government, we believe all the islands and rocks in the South China Sea are Chinese territories. And with these territories, we naturally could claim, according to international law, a contingency zone and exclusive economic zone. So we do not have a claim over the whole South China Sea. Yeah, so that is China's position. And having said all this, you would often read such words like China being aggressive, coercive, and all these kind of things. But then the point is, you cannot find a single example, of China using or even threatening to use force in the South China Sea. In fact, we and ASEAN countries are negotiating the so-called Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. This process is not as fast as it should be, but then the question is who is to be blamed? Because I would say nobody is to be blamed. People always neglect a fact. That is, actually among these ASEAN claimants, they have disputes among themselves. So I believe it is somewhat unfair that when we talk about South China Sea, it immediately becomes an issue between China and other claimants. No, it's not true.
Yes, what you're saying is that there are many disputes and that they don't only and solely involve the People's Republic of China. Now, maybe lastly on the South China Sea issue, if you could clarify, you mentioned the water cannons that have been used by the Chinese Coast Guard, which I know in prior interviews you've emphasized that it's the Coast Guard using these cannons and that they actually perhaps demonstrate that China is trying to prevent a larger conflict rather than start one. But I know that there's been other incidents of Philippines and Chinese vessels ramming into each other, running into each other. Could you talk about this? Because I hear it in CNN, in the Western media, that this demonstrates that China is escalating. What do you know about these particular incidents? I know there's been a few recently.
Well, if two ships are getting closer, there might be collision, right? And if one ship is trying to stop another ship from going somewhere, and there could be collision too. But I would not say, okay, which side decided to do that, because the other side is also trying to prevent some things from the other side. But if we just put all this aside for a while, my general feeling is that there won't be serious conflict in the South China Sea, partly because China's military strength is overwhelming. So we actually could put the situation under control. And because we have promised not to use force or threaten to use force in the South China Sea, as other claimants have also pledged. Therefore, my best hope is to let Mother Nature solve this problem, because Mother Nature has its own strengths, that is so-called force majeure, right? So let's just imagine for a moment, the ship itself is becoming more and more rusted, and China is not using force. So eventually, if it becomes disintegrated, because of Mother Nature, that probably serves the interest of everyone.
Right. You mentioned China's overwhelming military strength. Now, I don't think that there's a lot of understanding about China's capabilities other than, especially in the West, that it's a quote-unquote threat. So you are a veteran, a senior retired colonel of the People's Liberation Army. Could you talk about China's military capabilities and whether they actually do constitute a threat like we hear so much in the Western media?
That's a fascinating question, because I myself have to think about this, and sometimes I do not have a clear conclusion. But what I can say is PLA certainly is developing by leap and bounds. But the other side of the coin is that it has not fought a war ever since 1979. So this raises this question: can the PLA fight or not? Of course PLA can fight. If you compare to what happened in the past, after founding of People's Republic of China, China basically would have a war in every decade. Before 1979, when we had the last war with Vietnam. So afterwards, China has been committing to economic development, which actually give China more economic benefits that could be used to strengthen the military. So let me compare in this way. Maybe that will make sense more simple. Let's compare Russian military and Chinese military. I think before the war in Ukraine, it's universally accepted that Russia is at least the second best, next only to the United States, if it's not neck to neck with the United States. But if we compare PLA with Russian armed forces, the PLA's military budget is 3 times bigger than Russia's, although it is 4 times smaller than Americans. And its armed force is the largest in the world. Its number of ships is the largest in the world. Yeah? We are just having more and more state-of-art weapons, some of which might not be even available in Russia. So how could we prove that we are just a second-class military if Russia is not necessarily stronger than Chinese military? By the way, Russia has only one aircraft carrier, which is hardly moving anywhere because it has serious problems. And China is building even more aircraft carriers. So putting all this together, I would say that China's ambition of becoming a world-class military is logical. And this is not a secret because we have openly announced that we would become a world-class military by 2049. But actually, now we're talking about speeding up this process. There are two questions. One is, what is a world-class military? And then the second question is, with a defense budget that is only about 1.5%, which is certainly lower than NATO standard of 2% GDP, how can you develop your military into a world-class military? On the first question, I would say that it depends on how many countries can be said to be world-class military. If there is only one, that of course is the United States. But if there are more than one, most people would already consider China to be a world-class military already. So let's assume for a while that the United States is only one, and then we still have a long time to go. So I believe there are certain advantages for the PLA. One is political determination of the whole nation, including Chinese leadership. Because as I said, this is not a secret. We want to make our military world class. Then it is supported not only by a sustainable military budget, which is 3 times bigger than Russia's. Anyway, China's defense budget is the second largest in the world, because Chinese military is also supported by the largest industry in the world. So China has a strong military defense industry. In terms of shipbuilding capabilities, it's more than 200 times bigger than Americans. So with all this, we have confidence. Then, there is a dilemma, fundamental dilemma for the PLA. That is, how could you prove you're a world-class military without fighting? But my answer is very simple. Suppose you have a sword. You of course wish the sword is very sharp, but you cannot test the sharpness of your sword by chopping down somebody's head. That certainly is the wrong thing to do. So having peace actually has made China the second largest economy. In over 40 years. And that also helped China to alleviate the poverty of 800 million Chinese people in the same period of time. So peace is the largest benefit for China. So we should enjoy that, and we should try our best to maintain that. And that matters tremendously for the world. Because if you look at the world history, you can seldom find an example of a rising power rising so peacefully. So sometimes I'm thinking about this. The West would describe China as coercive and aggressive because it just cannot give a concrete example. Right. Chinese aggression anywhere, right? So the only incident is a deadly brawl between Chinese and Indian troops along Himalayan mountain. But even in that deadly brawl, there is something significant. Why? Because the two modern militaries were fighting against each other in a Stone Age manner. They were not shooting at each other. So that means they knew, at least subconsciously, that they should not shoot at each other in any circumstance.
Wow. Oftentimes when we're talking about military strength and war, we are measuring it by how much a nation has been able to win wars and how much the military conflicts have been successful. But China has had this long period of peace that I think it's a great point that you made, that how does then one assess this? And I think that is a good segue into my next question, because as you probably know, Mr. Zhou, that Colonel Zhou, that are planners, that there are think tanks that are constantly, actually, in the last several years, doing war simulations. So we're talking about the RAND Corporation or the Center for New American Security, both of which, of course, are very close to U.S. military planners. And I wanted to ask your thoughts about China's readiness for war, and with the United States in particular, because this is what they are strategizing. And where do you think such a scenario would lead? Because that's always what I'm thinking about, is you're planning and simulating these war games and these possible scenarios, but oftentimes it's a very pessimistic outlook that they end up concluding, whether or not they believe the U.S. wins or not. But what is your take on these war simulations and where such a conflict might lead between the United States and China?
I'm fully aware of what you said, the war games. Well, I would say that we should not really trust those results of the war games of American think tanks. Okay, to wrongly believe that China certainly is superior, that should not be what we think. But talking about the possible scenarios of conflicts or wars, yes, there are two places where China and the U.S. could come into conflict or even wars. One is South China Sea, the other is the Taiwan Strait. I put South China Sea, in front of Taiwan Strait because I have argued in South China Sea, in my article, simply in the title, "Is South China Sea stupid?" Why is that? Because in South China Sea, we cannot fully control the situation, because the American would send ships and aircraft, drones, satellites for closing reconnaissance, and that is not something we can, stop them. Sometimes they would have a freedom of navigation operations, but people sometimes hype up this freedom of navigation operation, but because they would only conduct around 20 or 21 times against 15 countries in a year. So generally speaking, in South China Sea, it won't be more than twice at least, to say the utmost. So the closing, reconnaissance and surveillance, both at sea or in the air, are dangerous scenarios, because China would believe that this is about our sovereignty and territorial integrity. The U.S. would not think so. The U.S. would just consider it's just a natural, freedom navigation over flight. I myself led the Chinese delegation to Pentagon to talk about these kind of legal implications of freedom of navigation in 2013. And I can tell you we could not agree much on this point. So we're looking at the same issue in different lights. But the international law, the international maritime law or the UN Convention Law of the Sea, is ambiguous enough, ironically, for both sides to justify their own position, quoting even the same article. So to come back to your questions, so if PLA is getting stronger, then we become less tolerant towards what we consider to be provocations. So sometimes this kind of dangerously close encounters would be seen. According to Pentagon, there are more than 180 interceptions in a couple of years. So that means that would mean one interception in every 4 days. So I do not have a solution for this. And I believe sometimes, pessimistically, that probably another collision will just cool down both sides. That is my conclusion. Then, why I would argue that South China Sea is more dangerous? Because this kind of things simply cannot be avoided. But in the Taiwan Strait is different, because we believe that we more or less could control the situation. Why? Because Taiwan cannot move away, because Taiwan is on the side of mainland China, because PLA is getting stronger. So no matter how the Taiwanese authority continue the separatist moves, by and large, I believe time and tide is on our side. So that is why I actually have more confidence about this issue. Then, of course, this is a billion-dollar question of whether the United States would intervene or not. Yeah, I do not have any answer, but people always talk about American strategic ambiguity. But I believe probably for them, China poses a bigger strategic ambiguity. That is whether China would use force or not, right? That is why American generals and admirals keep on guessing. Yes. Yeah, the worst doomsday scenario, yeah, when they believe, PLA would launch attack. So we actually have two strategic ambiguities. But I wish to quote Secretary of Defense Lord Austin's remarks at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Yeah, he said last year, and he mentioned this year, that he said last year that the conflict is not imminent or inevitable. I highly, highly value his remarks. And I wrote that in my essay in Foreign Affairs. Why? Because he talks with authority. Not only as, the senior-most defense officials, but because his remarks should, at least in theory, be supported by information and good intelligence. Yeah? So his remarks are just a direct denial of all those remarks made earlier by those generals and admirals. So he has demonstrated a kind of confidence, in the situation in the Taiwan Strait. And we, even until now, are still talking about peaceful reunification. So use of force is not a given in the Taiwan Strait. And we still hope for the best, that is peaceful reunification.
Yes. I think it's a great point that you made about the differences in the risks of conflict over the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, because for the United States, you mentioned there's a lot of guessing going on. Is it 2025? I've heard 2027. I've heard many dates about whether China would invade. And maybe you could just elaborate then on the question of Taiwan overall from this geopolitical and military strategic perspective, because this is where we hear most of the hype from the U.S. coming from. But then you also will have, as you said, leaders like Lloyd Austin talk about a conflict not being imminent. So there seems to be a lot of mixed messaging going on. What is the Chinese military perspective overall around Taiwan, given what we hear from the U.S. media? Is there a big difference, or are there things that we should know?
Well, for the Chinese military, it's very simple. You have to be prepared, for the worst scenario. So therefore, you got to become, stronger and stronger. There's no doubt about it. I think a bigger question is, how likely is still peace across strait? And I would say that the good thing is the Chinese government has never talked about a timetable for reunification. And that allows a lot of fresh air to come in. Yeah, because if you talk about timetable, then that is a totally different scenario. So this is what I have been imagining. You see, people always talk about, the so-called stick, of the Chinese government. But people forgot that we actually have also offered a lot of carrots. Yeah. For example, in Fujian province, which is, facing Taiwan on the side of mainland China, actually, there are a lot of preferential treatments toward the Taiwanese to let the children go to local kindergartens as other children, to give them a kind of a card which is not that different from our normal residential card. And we're even talking about providing electricity, and to my great surprise, building a bridge between our side and those outer islands. So all these are just efforts from Chinese government, to convince the Taiwanese people that we could live together. And I have been thinking about this seriously. You see, before COVID, it was reported that 1.5 million Taiwanese people actually were living in Chinese mainland. And most of them live around Shanghai. That is understandable because that is the best developed area over the Chinese mainland. But then I have to think about this question. Why can't they stay in a society that has a total different political system? Yeah, the answer is very simple. People would go wherever they can to find opportunities for better living. And those Taiwanese people are not, poor people. They are definitely middle-class people or even above, right? So that means if they can find better opportunities in the Chinese mainland, they won't mind that much a different political system. Yeah. So they were faring well. So that is where my confidence lies. I believe with the world becoming ever smaller as a result of globalization, as a result of artificial intelligence, the world is definitely becoming smaller. And so will be the integration across the straits. As a result, people would have better understanding. And as I said, we have not given a timetable. So that is where my confidence lies. I believe time would really tell eventually that we can become reunified in a peaceful manner. And this is my best hope.
Yes, I wanted to then follow up on this because the current leadership in Taiwan, on the Taiwan Strait side, Lai Ching-te, he recently came out and said that, well, if China wants to reunify Taiwan, why doesn't it also talk to Russia about some lands from long in the past? And then this gets me to the larger question of, you mentioned Taiwan separatism earlier. It also it goes along with U.S. military presence as well, because I know that there are also U.S. special forces just a couple of kilometers away from the mainland in Kinmen and surrounding islands. What do you make of these moves? Because we've talked a lot about China's military perspective, its influence, but of course the U.S. is playing a big role here, and even with regard to Taiwan, arms sales and even training of Taiwan forces, and of course what I mentioned with special forces just a couple of kilometers from the mainland. So what is your perspective and understanding of this?
Well, this kind of disagreement between the Chinese government and American government seems to be like a tit for tat or chicken or egg question, right? But when people ask me, how can we eventually resolve this issue? My answer is very simple. Just to let Beijing believe peaceful reunification is still possible, right? If peaceful reunification is still possible, then we will not use anti-secessional law, which said that we might resort to non-peaceful means if we feel peaceful reunification, the chance for peaceful reunification is gone forever. So then that would invite the role of the United States. Are you, at least in the eye of Beijing, supporting Taiwan's independence move or not, right? Because if you are doing that, that certainly would not serve your interest, right? So this is why I would say that such visits like that of Nancy Pelosi actually has done more harm to American interests. Joe Biden said, well, okay, because of the balanced, structure of American, administrative department, legislature, and so on and so forth. So it's not convenient, for him to intervene. No, we don't. We won't buy that. We in China would not be so naive to believe that he could not pick up a phone to give her a call to stop that, because he might consider that would be too harmful to his personal interest, and that would not be consequential. But as you have seen, PLA conducted 4 days live firing around this island. So as a result, I would say that the status quo, is somewhat changed, because after that, you would see more and more PLA aircraft flying over the medium line in the strait, and this now becomes irreversible. So I would say every provocation, either by the Taiwanese authority or by the American side, would create a change of status quo, which would become irreversible and would not be in the interest of either Washington or Taipei.
What do you think the motivation is then for these kind of provocations? Because, as you mentioned earlier, with regard to the war games, as well as with the South China Sea disputes, for example, that there's a lot of ambiguity on the Chinese side. But how does the Chinese side view U.S. motivations with regard to its growing military presence in the Pacific in general, and also just regard to with the Taiwan Straits question? Because we are seeing more and more of these provocations at the, you call them political or diplomatic level, but also on the military side, they seem to align. There seems, when there is a growing military presence from the United States in this region, it seems like these diplomatic and political efforts to hype up, for example, the Taiwan question and issue, they go together. So what is, I guess, what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, you mentioned about motivations. Actually, it's most difficult for people to tell what really are the motivation of other people. But maybe it's easier for us to tell, okay, what kind of interest of those people, yeah, that are driving these people to do something. For example, yeah, selling arms to Taiwan certainly is in the interest of American military-industrial complex, right? So even if they're talking about turning Taiwan into porcupine, but of course that is just a kind of excuse, because it serves the interest to sell things, to sell something. As far as Nancy Pelosi is concerned, because she has been championing this kind of support for democracy, and she knows that she was almost at the end of her term, so maybe she just want to do something, you know, to be in the highlight, yeah. For all these reasons, so we have to judge people more by the interests rather than motivations.